ChatGPT said, "The human brain is constantly bombarded with a sea of sensory information, yet remarkably, it is able to direct attention, filter out distractions, and maintain focus on specific tasks." At the center of this capability lies a deeply integrated system of sensory processing with hearing, or more specifically, the auditory system, playing a critical and often underappreciated role in modulating cognitive focus and facilitating learning. Understanding this system reveals a powerful truth. Our brain uses sound not only to detect the world around us, but also to shape how we learn, remember, and think. Sound waves enter the ear and stimulate the cochlea, a spiral-shaped organ filled with fluid and tiny hair cells. These cells convert mechanical vibrations into electrical signals, which are then transmitted to the auditory cortex via a complex relay through the brainstem. But this journey isn't merely about perceiving sounds, it's about categorizing them, assigning them importance, and aligning them with internal states of attention. This is where the auditory system becomes a tool for focus. Within milliseconds of a sound being registered, neural circuits in the reticular activating system, RAS, are engaged. This structure, embedded deep in the brainstem, plays a foundational role in wakefulness, alertness, and attention. When a sound is novel, loud, or behaviorally relevant, such as a teacher calling your name, a siren wailing, or a specific tone of voice, this system floods the cortex with neurochemical signals, primarily involving acetylcholine and norepinephrine. These neurochemicals serve to heighten alertness, suppress irrelevant background noise, both literal and figurative, and bring the focus of the brain's spotlight onto that auditory input. Interestingly, this process is not purely reactive. The brain is predictive. It anticipates when and where certain sounds will occur, especially if patterns have been previously learned. This is evident in phenomena like the cocktail party effect, where a person can focus on one voice amidst a noisy crowd. The auditory system has trained itself to prioritize that voice, particularly if it's familiar, meaningful, or emotionally charged. Learning in many ways depends on this ability to selectively attend. Without the capacity to filter auditory information, to hone in on the right input while ignoring the rest, learning becomes a chaotic and inefficient process. Sound also has a temporal component that profoundly influences cognition. Unlike visual stimuli, which can often be interpreted in static snapshots, sound unfolds over time. This means the brain must not only detect and process auditory input, it must remember the sequence, predict the next event, and maintain rhythm. These skills are deeply linked with working memory and executive function, both of which are essential for focus and learning. When students listen to lectures or instructions, their brains are constantly segmenting auditory streams into manageable pieces, holding them briefly in working memory and integrating them with long-term knowledge. This ongoing process requires temporal precision and disruptions, whether due to auditory processing disorders or environmental noise, can significantly degrade performance. The auditory cortex doesn't work alone in this process. It's tightly coupled with frontal regions of the brain, especially the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex (DLPFC), which is responsible for attention control and goal-directed behavior. When we actively try to focus, whether reading, solving a problem, or learning a new language, the auditory system can serve as a kind of external pacer or guide. For instance, rhythmic auditory cues like metronomes or low frequency binaural beats have been shown to modulate activity in the DLPFC, enhancing attention span and reducing cognitive fatigue. This synchronization between auditory input and executive control forms the backbone of many therapeutic interventions for ADHD and cognitive delay, such as auditory integration training or rhythmic entrainment therapies. Music is perhaps the most illustrative example of how sound guides cognition. Beyond its emotional resonance, music with a steady beat has been shown to improve attention and cognitive flexibility. The brain's natural tendency to entrain to rhythms, a phenomenon called neural entrainment, means that specific frequencies can optimize mental states. For example, auditory stimuli in the gamma range, around 40 Hz, can increase cortical activity associated with focus and higher-order cognition. This isn't mere theory. Experiments using auditory brainwave stimulation have demonstrated improvements in memory recall, task switching, and sustained concentration after exposure to rhythmic sounds in these frequency bands. Furthermore, auditory stimuli can act as cues for contextual memory retrieval. A student who studies a subject while listening to a particular piece of music may find it easier to recall that information when the same music is played later. This is known as context-dependent memory, and it works because the auditory input becomes linked to the internal neural state present during encoding. By reactivating the same sensory environment, the brain is better able to reconstruct the neural pathways associated with the learned material. The impact of auditory signals on learning and attention also has important implications in educational environments. Classrooms filled with background noise, whether it be air conditioners, hallway chatter, or traffic outside, can reduce comprehension and retention, particularly in younger children whose auditory systems are still developing. Research has shown that children in noisy classrooms score significantly lower on tests of verbal comprehension and reading fluency. This is not simply a matter of distraction, it's about signal-to-noise ratio. The more noise the auditory system has to filter, the more cognitive resources are used just to maintain basic understanding, leaving fewer resources available for encoding and memory consolidation. The good news is that the brain is plastic, and with training, the auditory system can become more efficient at enhancing focus. Musicians, for example, often exhibit superior auditory discrimination abilities, enhanced working memory, and greater structural connectivity between auditory and frontal cortices. These changes are not limited to elite performers. Even brief periods of musical training can improve the brain's ability to process auditory information and direct attention. This suggests that targeted auditory training could be a valuable tool not just for musicians, but for students, professionals, and individuals with attentional deficits. In parallel, the role of auditory alerts and cues in digital learning platforms is becoming increasingly important. When well designed, these cues can guide the learner's focus, reduce cognitive load, and segment content into digestible units. When poorly designed, think of jarring notifications or inconsistent audio feedback that can fragment attention and increase stress. This highlights the need for evidence-based design in educational technology, grounded in our growing understanding of auditory neuroscience. Auditory input is also vital during sleep and rest periods, which are crucial for consolidating what we learn. The brain continues to process sound during sleep, albeit at a subconscious level. Low-frequency white noise has been shown to improve slow-wave sleep, which is the stage most closely associated with memory consolidation. Conversely, irregular or jarring sounds during sleep can cause micro-arousals, disrupting the deep sleep stages needed for learning retention. Thus, the auditory environment before and during sleep can either support or undermine the learning process. Additionally, sound can affect emotional regulation, which plays a critical role in learning. Pleasant, predictable auditory stimuli can reduce cortisol levels and promote a parasympathetic state, enhancing the brain's readiness for focus and plasticity. Harsh or chaotic noise, on the other hand, can elevate stress hormones, impair working memory, and hinder learning. This link between emotion and hearing is largely mediated by the amygdala, which evaluates auditory inputs for threat or safety. This system evolved to protect us, but in modern environments, it can be easily hijacked by chronic noise or overwhelming sensory input. Another fascinating aspect of auditory influence is the role of language and inner speech in learning. Even when we read silently or solve a math problem, we often use internal verbalization, a form of auditory imagery, to guide our thoughts. This process engages many of the same auditory circuits involved in actual hearing, Inner speech helps to organize ideas, rehearse steps, and maintain focus, especially during complex tasks. Training the brain to use clear and structured internal dialogue through techniques like verbal rehearsal, mental summarization, or even subvocalization can enhance comprehension and cognitive control. In light of all this, we can begin to appreciate the auditory system not just as a sense, but as a cognitive scaffold, a structure that supports attention, memory, executive function, and even motivation. Sound informs the brain where to look, when to act, and what to remember. It sets the rhythm for thought, encodes the sequence of experience, and guides the spotlight of consciousness itself. Whether it's a teacher's voice, a rhythmic beat, a whispered word, or even silence in the right pattern, what we hear has profound consequences for how we learn and how we grow. In closing, the auditory system is a key regulator of focus, and through its deep integration with attention circuits, emotional centers, and memory systems, it becomes a primary driver of learning. By understanding and leveraging this system through auditory training, environmental design, rhythm, and focused listening, we can dramatically enhance the brain's capacity to learn, adapt, and thrive in an increasingly noisy world. The sounds we surround ourselves with and the way we listen can either scatter our focus or sculpt the very pathways of our mind. The vestibular system, housed deep within the inner ear, plays a profound and often underestimated role in cognitive functioning, particularly in how we focus, regulate attention, and learn. Traditionally associated with balance and spatial orientation, the vestibular apparatus has long been relegated to the realm of motor coordination. But emerging neuroscience reveals that this system is far more than a stabilizer of posture. It is a regulator of arousal, a modulator of attention, and a silent architect of learning. Driven brain states, its reach extends far beyond physical equilibrium. It directly influences how the brain transitions between alertness, calmness, and readiness to encode new information. Anatomically, the vestibular system consists of semicircular canals and otolith organs, the utricle and saccule, which detect angular and linear accelerations of the head. These structures send signals to the brain through the vestibular nerve, which travels alongside the auditory nerve, forming the vestibulocochlear nerve. The signals are relayed to the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem, and from there they project to multiple areas of the brain: the cerebellum for motor control, the thalamus for sensory integration, the autonomic nervous system for physiological state regulation, and critically, to the cortex, especially the parietal, temporal, and prefrontal lobes involved in cognition. One of the most powerful effects of vestibular activation is on neural arousal. Just like the auditory system can heighten awareness with sound, the vestibular system can alter our brain state through movement. A subtle change in head position, a quick tilt or full body motion sends a cascade of signals that the brain interprets not only in terms of motion, but also in terms of relevance. Movement cues the brain to shift attention, adjust its arousal level, and engage in sensory recalibration. For this reason, vestibular input can shift the brain from a state of low motivation or mental fog into one of alertness, readiness, and focus. The ascending reticular activating system, ARAS, responsible for modulating consciousness and attention, is influenced by signals from the vestibular nuclei. This is part of the reason why even minimal physical movement, rocking, swaying, or nodding, can increase wakefulness and shift the brain into an optimal state for receiving and processing information. This same mechanism is at work when people naturally pace while trying to think, or sway slightly while focusing on a difficult task. The brain intuitively uses vestibular stimulation to keep itself alert and cognitively engaged. There is also a bidirectional relationship between vestibular activity and emotional state. Vestibular input regulates activity in the limbic system, especially the amygdala and hypothalamus, which are involved in emotional processing and stress responses. A dysregulated vestibular system can contribute to anxiety, distractibility, and poor emotional self-regulation, all of which impair learning. Conversely, Healthy vestibular function stabilizes not just physical balance, but emotional equilibrium. Activities that stimulate the vestibular system rhythmically, like swinging, spinning, or even walking at a consistent pace, can lower stress, reduce overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, and promote a parasympathetic, learning, conducive brain state. In fact, vestibular stimulation is one of the few sensory inputs that can rapidly shift autonomic balance. When engaged properly, it reduces the stress hormone cortisol, slows heart rate variability in a beneficial way, and supports the release of dopamine and serotonin, neurochemicals crucial for reward-based learning and emotional resilience. This is why rocking infants calms them. It's not just comfort, it's vestibular regulation of their nervous system, preparing their brain for sensory integration and cognitive development. In classroom and clinical settings, children with vestibular processing issues often exhibit difficulty sitting still, concentrating, or following instructions. This isn't just behavioral, it's neurological. Their brains are not receiving the right balance of sensory input needed to maintain postural control and regulate attention. They may compensate by constantly moving, fidgeting, or avoiding tasks that require sustained mental effort. Without appropriate vestibular feedback, the brain struggles to anchor attention in space and time, resulting in poor working memory, weak task initiation, and fragmented learning. This reinforces the idea that focus is not purely a mental event, it's deeply embodied. The cerebellum, long known for its role in motor coordination, is also heavily involved in cognitive sequencing and error correction during learning. The vestibular system sends a constant stream of information to the cerebellum, allowing it to calibrate posture and motion, but also to fine-tune mental sequencing, language processing, and predictive modeling. For example, when you're learning a new concept, your brain needs to anticipate the next step in a sequence, whether it's solving a math equation, conjugating a verb, or reading a complex sentence. Vestibular, cerebellar loops help manage this sequencing by integrating motor and cognitive timing. Disruption in this pathway can lead to learning difficulties, such as dyslexia or problems with verbal fluency and executive function. Furthermore, the vestibular system supports spatial awareness, which is integral not only for movement but for organizing thoughts and information. The brain uses internal maps to represent the external world, and these maps are updated continuously through vestibular input. This is how we track our position in a room, orient ourselves toward a speaker, or navigate from one location to another. But these same spatial maps are also used for abstract cognitive processes like understanding timelines, arranging narratives, or even visualizing math problems. When the vestibular system is actively engaged, it enhances the brain's capacity to form and manipulate mental representations, crucial tools for higher order learning. Modern research supports this connection between vestibular input and learning. Studies in both animals and humans have demonstrated that vestibular stimulation enhances hippocampal activity, the region responsible for memory encoding and spatial learning. In rodent studies, when the vestibular system was damaged, hippocampal plasticity was reduced and spatial learning tasks were impaired. In human studies, vestibular-based interventions have shown benefits in memory recall, attention span, and even reading comprehension, particularly in populations with sensory integration difficulties. Vestibular stimulation also has a time-based element that interacts with the brain's circadian rhythms. Regular movement throughout the day, including walking, stretching, and even brief balance exercises, helps anchor the brain's internal clock. This regulation is crucial for maintaining stable cycles of alertness, sleep, and hormonal rhythms, all of which influence learning. A well-calibrated circadian system supports sleep, dependent memory consolidation, which is when the brain reinforces and reorganizes neural connections made during the day. Disruption in this cycle, often due to sedentary lifestyles and excessive screen time, contributes to cognitive fatigue, reduced motivation, and impaired learning. In practical terms, engaging the vestibular system can be a powerful tool to reset attention and enhance cognitive readiness. Techniques as simple as standing up and doing a few head tilts, walking in a figure-8 pattern, or sitting on a balance ball can dramatically change the neural context in which learning occurs. These activities trigger low-level vestibular stimulation that enhances alertness without causing stress or overstimulation. Over time, these micro-adjustments can build stronger vestibular cortical connections, improving not only physical balance, but also mental balance and attentional control. This has important implications for educational design. Traditional classrooms often demand prolonged stillness, which deprives the vestibular system of the input it needs to help regulate brain state. Integrating movement breaks, flexible seating, or even short balance exercises into the learning routine can optimize attention and memory encoding. Similarly, therapeutic interventions like vestibular therapy, sensory integration therapy, and interactive metronome training use vestibular input to enhance brain organization and learning outcomes, especially in children with developmental delays or neurodivergence. The vestibular system is also critical for interoception, the brain's awareness of the body's internal state. When we feel centered, grounded, and bodily aware, we are more capable of maintaining emotional control, perspective, and cognitive stability. The vestibular system informs our sense of self in space, which in turn influences our confidence, motivation, and ability to persist through complex cognitive tasks. This inner anchoring is why athletes, dancers, and performers who typically have well-trained vestibular systems often demonstrate not just physical mastery, but mental poise and sharp learning agility. There is also compelling evidence that vestibular activation can enhance neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire and strengthen its connections. Movement-based learning, when coupled with intentional focus, creates an ideal neurochemical environment for synaptic change. This involves the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, a protein that promotes the growth and resilience of neurons. Vestibular activation stimulates regions like the hippocampus and cerebellum, which are rich in BDNF receptors, thereby accelerating the process of learning and memory formation. This is why incorporating physical motion into learning, such as using gestures when memorizing vocabulary or walking while brainstorming, enhances retention and engagement. It's also important to acknowledge that the vestibular system has critical windows of development, particularly in early childhood. During these sensitive periods, regular vestibular stimulation through crawling, rolling, climbing, and swinging lays the neurological foundation for later academic skills. Children who miss out on this input due to overly constrained environments develop mental delays or limited physical play, often exhibit challenges with attention, balance, and sensory regulation. The good news is that the vestibular system remains plastic into adulthood, and with targeted engagement, its functions can be improved at any age. In conclusion, the vestibular system is a hidden driver of learning potential. Through its influence on arousal regulation, spatial awareness, emotional balance, and memory formation, it creates the neural conditions necessary for effective focus and cognitive engagement. By integrating vestibular activation into daily routines, whether through movement, balance exercises, or rhythmic activity, we can harness the full power of the brain's natural learning mechanisms. The lesson is simple yet profound. When we move with intention, we learn with greater clarity, precision, and depth. The vestibular system is not just a mechanism of physical stability, it is a gateway to cognitive vitality. The coordination between hearing, balance, and vision creates a powerful triad that enhances our ability to perceive, orient, and learn from the world around us. These sensory systems do not operate in isolation. Rather, they communicate continuously in an intricate web of multisensory integration that shapes our attention, memory, motor skills, and decision-making. When properly synchronized, this integration allows for a state of heightened situational awareness, enabling individuals to not only absorb information more effectively, but also apply it fluidly across contexts. This is particularly relevant in learning environments, where attention, engagement, and comprehension are deeply tied to how well the brain can align what it hears, sees, and physically feels. One of the most important aspects of learning is visual. Spatial attention, our ability to focus on specific objects or locations in space while ignoring irrelevant distractions. This process is closely guided by auditory and vestibular cues. For instance, when a teacher speaks in a classroom, the voice provides not just information, but also directional cues that help students orient their gaze and attention. The vestibular system stabilizes the gaze via the vestibulo-ocular reflex, VOR, which allows the eyes to remain fixed on an object even while the head is moving. This reflex is critical for reading, tracking, and scanning, skills fundamental to effective learning. Imagine a student taking notes during a lecture. Their head may tilt slightly or shift as they look between the teacher and their notebook. With each movement, the vestibular system provides the brain with real-time information about head position and motion. The auditory system processes the teacher's voice, adjusting attention to match intonation and emphasis. The visual system tracks the movement of the pen and visual cues from slides or the chalkboard. All three systems are feeding data into the brain simultaneously. When these inputs are in sync, the brain can effectively fuse them into a coherent perceptual experience, enhancing comprehension and retention. When they are out of sync, however, such as in individuals with sensory integration disorders or after brain injury, learning becomes fragmented, tiring, and often frustrating. This synchronization also enhances sensoromotor learning, where perception and action are tightly coupled. Activities such as sports, dance, and music require precise coordination between what one sees, hears, and feels in space. For example, a dancer responding to a beat must process the rhythm auditory, the floor and surrounding dancers visual, and their body's position in space vestibular. These simultaneous inputs help the brain learn movement sequences and adjust them in real time. Studies show that individuals who engage in multisensory activities tend to perform better on tasks involving executive function, working memory, and even abstract reasoning, all of which are crucial for academic success. From a neuroscience perspective, this occurs because multisensory input strengthens communication between brain regions. For instance, the superior colliculus, a midbrain structure involved in orienting responses, receives inputs from auditory, visual, and vestibular systems, and helps direct attention towards stimuli of importance. When a sound and a visual cue occur together, activation in the superior colliculus is significantly greater than when either occurs alone. This principle, known as multisensory enhancement, allows the brain to form stronger, more reliable neural representations of the external world, facilitating better learning. Another key area involved in this multisensory integration is the parietal cortex, particularly the intraparietal sulcus, which plays a central role in coordinating visual, spatial attention. It receives and integrates input from the eyes, ears, and inner ear to build a coherent spatial map. This map is what allows you to understand not just where objects are in relation to each other, but also where your body is in relation to those objects. This spatial awareness is critical for navigating environments, understanding geometry, performing calculations, and organizing thoughts in a coherent mental framework. In learning, this becomes evident in tasks such as reading comprehension, where the brain must track lines of text, anticipate sentence structure, and connect meanings across paragraphs. Eye movement coordination, supported by vestibular input, is essential for scanning the page efficiently. The rhythm and prosody of inner speech, informed by auditory processing, help guide interpretation and prediction. The result is a tightly orchestrated symphony of sensory input that makes abstract thought possible. If one system is out of tune, such as poor eye tracking, low auditory discrimination, or weak balance control, the entire learning process can be disrupted. A fascinating example of this can be seen in students with develop mental coordination disorder, DCD, or sensory processing disorder, SPD. These individuals often struggle with writing, reading, and focus not due to intellectual deficits, but because their sensory systems are not well integrated. They may have difficulty maintaining eye contact, locating sounds, or orienting themselves in a room. These challenges can result in poor engagement and low academic performance. When given targeted interventions that engage multiple sensory systems, such as balance training paired with auditory cues, many show marked improvement in attention and learning capacity. This phenomenon is not limited to children or those with diagnosed disorders. In fact, every learner benefits from well-synchronized sensory input. Teachers who incorporate visual, auditory, and kinesthetic elements into their lessons tend to see higher engagement and retention among students. For example, using gestures while speaking, adding relevant sounds to visual materials, or encouraging movement while reviewing content creates embodied learning experiences that are more memorable and impactful. These practices leverage the natural interdependence of hearing, balance, and vision to reinforce the brain's encoding processes. The vestibular system, in particular, has a direct influence on how we perceive directionality and movement within our visual field. This is crucial for tracking motion, which is involved in both reading and real-time interpretation of dynamic content, such as video or presentations. When the vestibular system stabilizes the head and orients the body, it allows the eyes to smoothly follow moving targets, a skill necessary for sustained focus. Inadequate vestibular feedback can lead to symptoms like visual fatigue, difficulty reading, and even nausea during screen-based learning, symptoms often misattributed to poor attention or motivation. Moreover, sound localization, an ability dependent on binaural hearing, provides essential spatial information that complements vision and balance. When we hear a sound, the brain calculates its direction and distance by comparing the slight differences in timing and intensity between the two ears. This allows us to turn our gaze toward the source, a behavior known as the orienting reflex. Combined with vestibular input about head position and visual confirmation of the source, this reflex forms the basis of how we shift focus in dynamic environments. In real-world settings, classrooms, sports fields, workplaces, this triangulation of sensory input enhances alertness and improves reaction time. Technology offers another lens through which to examine this integration. Virtual reality, VR, and augmented reality, our systems rely on a close coupling of visual, auditory, and vestibular inputs to create immersive environments. When these cues are not well aligned, such as when the visual field shifts too quickly without corresponding head movement, it leads to sensory mismatch, which can cause disorientation or motion sickness. This is a powerful illustration of how crucial sensory synchronization is to our sense of presence and stability. In contrast, well-designed VR environments that respect these sensory relationships can be used to enhance learning by creating rich, embodied experiences that reinforce memory and understanding through active engagement of all three systems. A similar principle applies to navigation and spatial memory, which depend on a combination of auditory cues, visual landmarks, and vestibular feedback. When learning how to navigate a new campus or city, people use all three modalities to build a mental map. This mental map is stored primarily in the hippocampus, a region that is strongly influenced by multisensory input. Experiments have shown that hippocampal activity is heightened when individuals engage in real-world navigation compared to passive observation, suggesting that active multisensory involvement is key to forming lasting spatial memories. There are also profound implications for motor learning and rehabilitation. Patients recovering from stroke, traumatic brain injury, or neurodegenerative conditions often undergo therapies that involve auditory cueing, balance training, and visual tracking exercises. These therapies do more than restore motor function. They rewire the brain by stimulating multisensory pathways that support attention and learning. Even in healthy individuals, incorporating these elements into training regimens can enhance skill acquisition. For example, athletes and musicians who train under conditions that integrate visual, auditory, and vestibular challenges develop faster reaction times, better adaptability, and greater performance resilience under pressure. At a deeper level, the synchronization of hearing, balance, and vision also shapes our sense of agency, the feeling that we are in control of our actions and can predict their consequences. This sense is foundational to motivation, confidence, and the willingness to take on new learning challenges. When the sensory systems are well integrated, the brain can accurately simulate the outcomes of actions, compare them to expectations, and adjust behavior accordingly. This process, often called internal modeling, is essential for adaptive learning. Disruptions in sensory integration can impair this modeling, leading to uncertainty, hesitation, and avoidance of cognitively demanding tasks. Interestingly, even the timing of sensory inputs plays a critical role. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to when, not just what, stimuli occur. Synchronous auditory and visual inputs, especially when delivered in rhythmic patterns, can entrain neural oscillations, coordinated waves of brain activity that govern attention and perception. These rhythms, particularly in the alpha and gamma bands, help gate information flow, suppress distractions, and enhance learning. This is why rhythmic auditory cues, like metronomes or beats, can improve concentration and task performance, especially when paired with movement. To maximize learning, it's crucial to design experiences that align these sensory systems. Whether it's in the classroom, a workplace training module, or a digital learning platform, leveraging auditory cues that match visual content and encouraging physical engagement, even something as simple as head movement or body posture, can dramatically enhance focus and retention. Multisensory environments are not just more engaging, they are more biologically aligned with how the brain is designed to operate. Ultimately, the synchronization of hearing, balance, and vision does more than enhance perception. It builds a dynamic framework for thinking, acting, and learning in the real world. By activating and aligning these systems, we can deepen cognitive engagement, improve memory encoding, and make learning not only more efficient but more intuitive. Through a richer understanding of these interactions, we unlock the ability to craft environments and experiences that empower the brain to function at its full potential. The future of learning is not just about what we see or hear, it's about how well we integrate all the senses to build a cohesive, embodied, and deeply connected understanding of the world. Neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to change its structure and function in response to experience, is the foundation of all learning. It is what allows us to form new memories, master new skills, adapt to environments, and even recover after injury. While traditionally we've thought of neuroplasticity as primarily driven by repetition, attention, and motivation, a growing body of research is now revealing that the coordination and integration of multiple sensory systems, especially hearing and balance, plays a critical role in shaping and enhancing plastic changes in the brain. When auditory and vestibular inputs are activated in tandem, they don't just enhance perception or alertness, they actively prime the brain for learning, increase synaptic strength, and create conditions that promote long-term changes in connectivity across neural networks. At a cellular level, neuroplasticity is governed by the principles of long-term potentiation, LTP, and long-term depression, limited mechanisms that strengthen or weaken synapses based on the frequency and intensity of activation. To trigger these changes effectively, the brain needs a rich, coordinated, and repeated stream of inputs that are both meaningful and engaging. This is where multisensory integration becomes crucial. When the auditory and vestibular systems are engaged simultaneously, they generate a broader and more dynamic pattern of activation across the cortex and subcortical structures than either system could alone. These combined inputs engage distributed neural circuits that span from the brainstem to the cerebellum, thalamus, hippocampus, basal ganglia, and prefrontal cortex, all regions involved in learning. Memory and attention. One of the key mechanisms through which this occurs is through cross, modal plasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on input from multiple sensory channels. In individuals with intact sensory systems, this means that learning that occurs through multisensory engagement is often more robust, more durable, and more easily generalized to new contexts. For instance, when a child learns the alphabet through song and movement, hearing the letters, saying them aloud, and swaying or gesturing with their body, multiple sensory systems are activated together, strengthening associations in a way that simple rote memorization cannot. These multimodal connections form the basis of richer neural maps that can be accessed more flexibly across different situations, increasing retrieval and application. The auditory system plays a central role in driving plasticity because it directly interacts with the timing and rhythm systems of the brain. Sounds, especially those with a regular tempo or melodic structure, create temporal scaffolding, a kind of neural framework that organizes information in time. This scaffolding helps the brain determine when to pay attention, how to sequence information, and how to hold items in working memory for later retrieval. These temporal codes are vital for everything from language processing to executive function. When auditory input is combined with vestibular stimulation, such as rocking, walking, or turning the head, these timing cues become more salient and embodied, further enhancing their impact on synaptic encoding. The vestibular system contributes by modulating arousal states and spatial processing, two domains that are essential for learning readiness and neural receptivity. When the vestibular system is activated through movement, it influences neurotransmitter systems that affect attention, mood, and motivation, especially acetylcholine, dopamine, and norepinephrine. These chemicals lower the threshold for LTP, essentially making it easier for the brain to strengthen synapses in response to meaningful input. This is why movement-based learning activities such as dancing, playing sports, or simply walking while studying can lead to better retention of information. They provide the vestibular boost that tunes the brain to a more plastic, learning, ready state. Moreover, the vestibular system enhances neuroplasticity through its interaction with the cerebellum, a brain region traditionally associated with motor control but now recognized as a major player. In cognitive function, the cerebellum is involved in the fine-tuning of thought, prediction, and error correction, skills that are fundamental to learning. Through its connections with the vestibular nuclei, the cerebellum receives constant feedback about head and body movement, and it uses this information not only to coordinate physical motion, but to calibrate cognitive processes like timing, sequencing, and attention switching. When the auditory and vestibular systems are activated together, they reinforce cerebellar learning loops that support both physical coordination and cognitive flexibility. There is also a strong relationship between multisensory integration and the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor BDNF, a key molecule in the promotion of plasticity. BDNF acts like a fertilizer for neurons, enhancing their growth, survival, and ability to form new synaptic connections. Physical activity, particularly those involving balance and rhythm, has been shown to increase BDNF levels significantly. When combined with auditory learning, the effects are even more pronounced. For example, studies have found that children who receive music education involving movement and rhythm games exhibit higher levels of BDNF and show greater improvements in executive functioning, attention control, and academic achievement compared to those who receive passive instruction. Beyond childhood, neuroplasticity driven by sensory integration remains potent across the lifespan. Adults who engage in multisensory training activities such as learning a musical instrument, practicing Tai Chi, or participating in dance classes often show enhanced cognitive resilience, improved memory, and even delayed onset of age-related cognitive decline. These practices combine auditory feedback, movement, spatial awareness, and balance, leading to the activation of multiple brain regions and reinforcing the neural networks that underlie fluid intelligence and adaptability. In rehabilitation settings, these same principles are applied to promote recovery after brain injury. Patients recovering from stroke or traumatic brain injury often show faster progress when therapy incorporates multisensory stimuli. Vestibular exercises, such as head tilts, balance challenges, or visual tracking while in motion, combined with auditory cues, can stimulate dormant neural pathways and encourage reorganization of function. This is because these activities do more than restore movement or hearing. They tap into the brain's natural drive to form new connections when challenged with complex, coordinated input. Even in the absence of injury, everyday learning can be enhanced by strategically integrating hearing and balance. Consider a student studying a difficult concept. If they simply read the material silently, the engagement may be low and the memory trace weak. But if that same student reads aloud, paces while reviewing, or uses gestures to emphasize key ideas, they are engaging auditory and vestibular systems that provide additional layers of encoding. These layers act like multiple threads woven into the same memory fabric, making the information stronger and more accessible. This approach also helps overcome common learning difficulties. Students with ADHD, for instance, often have challenges with attention regulation, working memory, and task persistence. These issues are often exacerbated by weak sensory integration. However, interventions that stimulate both auditory and vestibular systems like rhythmic drumming, interactive metronome training, or movement-based learning games have shown promise in improving focus and executive control. These tools create a synchrony between internal neural rhythms and external sensory input, fostering the kind of engagement that neuroplasticity thrives on. From an educational policy standpoint, this suggests that we must move beyond traditional models of passive, sedentary learning. The idea that learning happens best when students are quiet, still, and solely focused on a visual medium ignores the wealth of evidence supporting multisensory engagement. Classrooms that encourage movement, oral expression, rhythmic activity, and sensory exploration create fertile ground for neuroplasticity. Even simple strategies like using music to signal transitions, incorporating balance boards or standing desks, or allowing students to walk while discussing a topic can make a measurable difference in learning outcomes. Importantly, the benefits of sensory-driven plasticity are not limited to structured activities. Everyday experiences also matter. Walking in nature while listening to a podcast, dancing to music while learning a language, or playing a musical instrument that requires physical coordination all harness the natural interplay of auditory and vestibular inputs. These real-world experiences don't just make learning more enjoyable, they make it more neurologically effective. Even in contemplative practices like mindfulness or meditation, the body plays a central role. Techniques such as body scanning, conscious breathing, or rhythmic chanting engage the vestibular and auditory systems in ways that promote calm, focus, and neuroplastic potential. Slow rhythmic movement, combined with internally generated auditory cues like humming or mantras, it can bring the brain into a deeply focused state, optimizing the balance of excitatory and inhibitory signals in the cortex. This not only enhances well-being, but also increases the brain's readiness to learn and adapt. In research on peak performance, whether in athletes, artists, or innovators, one consistent finding is that those who regularly engage in practices that integrate multiple sensory systems tend to show more rapid skill acquisition, higher levels of creativity, and better stress regulation. These individuals often describe being in a flow state, a condition characterized by intense focus, seamless action, and a sense of timelessness. Flow is thought to be a product of highly efficient neural communication across distributed brain networks, many of which are activated and aligned through synchronized sensory input. Ultimately, the path to enhanced neuroplasticity runs through the body's senses. Hearing and balance are not passive experiences. They are active, dynamic drivers of brain change. When we harness the synergy between them, we unlock deeper states of focus, more durable learning, and a greater capacity for adaptation. Whether we are teaching a child to read, rehabilitating a patient from injury, or trying to learn a new skill ourselves, the key is not just what we do, but how we do it. Engaging the brain through sound and motion creates a richer sensory context, a more active brain state, and a more plastic nervous system. This means the environments we create, our classrooms, homes, workspaces, and even recreational activities should all be designed with sensory integration in mind. Learning does not occur in a vacuum. It is embedded in rhythms, motions, sounds, and sensations. And the more we embrace this reality, the more effectively we can tap into the incredible power of the human brain to grow, adapt, and evolve throughout the entire arc of life.